15 years old, we didn't worry about all the things that went on in our neighborhood because we had some wonderful things going on. And the irony is that when I went to visit my cousins, they lived in nice places, but if you looked up and down the block, you never saw a human being. You didn't see a movie. You didn't see anything. You didn't see a park. You didn't see a movie. You didn't see a playground. Empty. But when you walk downstairs in my neighborhood, in my house, we had four corners. We had a candy store, a butcher. We had a drugstore. A lot of people hanging out, and we always had a lot of fun. I mean, we grew up in a neighborhood where it was a constant ball. We had movies, 5 walking distance. The Loews Canal was the second biggest movie in New York City, next to Radio City Music Hall. We had parks, we had recreation centers, we had, right a half a block away from my house was a double-layer park. Downstairs we had football, basketball, handball. Upstairs was a kiddie pool. They had benches. They had, we had a house where you could take out anything you wanted. And in the street we had all kinds of things going on. We had restaurants. Now you have to understand, this is all walking distance from my house. We had restaurants. We had the best Jewish restaurants in the city. We on Hester Street, and Delancey Street, and Orchard Street. We had Italian restaurants in Little Italy that were the best in the city. We had Chinese restaurants in Chinatown. It was the best in the city, and Chinese restaurants all over the place. So life was wonderful. It was just an absolute gas. And we also had swimming pools. We had many indoor swimming pools. We had recreational centers. And we had the biggest swimming pool in New York City, and that was the East River, and that's where we swam all summer long. And that was a very big pool. Now, I love the kids, I love my friends, I love the neighborhood, I love my neighbors. And one day we got a letter that we had to move. And I was very unhappy about that. We had to move 5 miles away, and there goes my neighborhood, there goes my friends, and there goes my good times. But I did have a friend who I made was kind of strange, and because she was a little old Jewish lady, and she lived across the hall from us. Her name was Mrs. Barn. And I loved Mrs. Barn because she loved to talk to me. She always had a smile for me, and she cooked the most delicious food in the world. The 2 things that were outstanding was potato latkes, which, who knows what a potato latkes is? Hooray for the latkes people! And then she made cholent. Who knows what cholent is? Hooray for a Jew! Well, cholent is a recipe. It's an original recipe, and it's an authentic recipe, and Mrs. Bohr made that. And she started off with a big pot and put in meat, potatoes, barley, beans, a lot of beans, and secret things that she put in that she wouldn't share with my mother, because my mother made cholent too, but not as often. Mrs. Bohr made it very often. And my mother was always bitching and moaning that I was so skinny that I should eat, and she would drive me crazy. Half the time I wanted to run away from home. I couldn't take it anymore. She told me about the kids in China, they're all starving. Who gives a shit? Well, anyway, she would make this stew, and she would wrap it. She spent all day making it, then she put kishka inside, which is a stuffing, and you have chicken skin that you wrap around this ingredient, and then you sew it up and you chuck it in, and there was all kinds of stuff going on, and there was like a witch's brew. But the smell of it was, when I smelled it, the water would start running out of my mouth. I was drooling all over the place. She would put paper on the top, and she would put a cord around it, and put it on top of the stove, and it started off at 6 o'clock at night when the flame went on, and it went off at 12 o'clock noon the next day. She took the cord off, and then she lifted the paper, and when she lifted that paper, the aroma of the chunt went from her apartment down the hall into my house, up the stairs to the 5th floor, down the stairs, out into the street. And I waited for noon because I know it was going to happen. So what happens is noontime, I run upstairs, and sure enough, she got the chunt ready to eat. And it was the most delicious thing I ever ate in my life. Except now I don't eat things like that because it's actually a heart attack special. Well, the bad news is that we were leaving, and I was very unhappy. One day we walked out of the house, and Mrs. Baum is walking in front of us, and my mother says, Mrs. Baum, hold up. And Mrs. Baum stops, and she says, Ruthie, oh, hi, Ruthie, how are you? And Richy, oh, Richy, how are you? I'm so unhappy you're leaving. And my mother says, Mrs. Baum, I want you to join us to go to Meltz's Deli. We're going to have a delicious kosher sandwich. And Mrs. Baum says, oh, Ruthie, that's so nice of you. Thank you. And we start to walk to the deli. Now, this is a kosher deli that was famous all over the area. They made the best corned beef and the best pastrami ever. You don't eat food like that anymore. If you get pastrami in Tucson, well, she starts to talk to my mother and says, you know, Ruthie, she says, Richy is such a wonderful boy. She says, he's my friend, and I love him. I love him like a grandson. He always talks to me, and he understands everything I talk about, and he's so bright and so mature, and he understands everything I say, and we have these wonderful conversations in Yiddish. And I said to myself, oh God, let my mother keep a big mouth shut. And sure enough, that's not my mother's style. And she says, Mrs. Baum, Richy doesn't understand Yiddish, and he doesn't speak Yiddish. Well, Mrs. Baum looked at me, and her little rosy cheeks that I always saw turned blood red. And she looked at me with evil eyes. And I could see that she had a certain amount of hatred in her, and she was deceived. I lied to her all these years. Well, it was very sad, and I knew I could feel it in my chest, and we never got to talk to her again because we moved away. Well, 50 years later, we moved here from New York, and I joined a writing club. And in the writing club, I told them about Mrs. Baum, and I told them about my story, that I have this 800-pound gorilla on my shoulder. Whenever I think of the Lower East Side, whenever I think of Mrs. Baum, I get depressed, I get unhappy, and I feel this weight. So they told me, they said, you know, Richy, give it up. You don't have to really worry about that because Mrs. Baum was a very smart lady. And I'm sure after a week, or a month, or a year, or 2 years, she finally said to herself, you know, Richy was such a sweet boy. He didn't deceive me. He didn't even have to stay and talk to me. He chose to talk to me, an old lady, and he confided in me, and he listened to me, and he was such a sweet boy. How could I ever think of him as a deceiver? He didn't deceive me. He was considerate of me. And when they said that to me, wow, I took a deep breath. God, this gorilla that was on my shoulder, all of a sudden, I just felt like he was gone. And I looked there, and sure enough, the gorilla took a hike. And from walking around like this, every time I talked about this story, look at me now.